Hello and welcome to the presentation that I gave at Sunstone 2024. Let me first give a special thank you to Lynn Coburna for moderating this session, to Lindsay Hansen Park for inviting me to speak at Sunstone 2024, to Grace Poole for making it happen, and to all of you watching this presentation at home. My name is Lars Nielsen, and in honor of our next speaker, Dan McClellan, the fit for this presentation is the glass looker. Now let me kick things off with a question. Oh, what's in a name? A rose by any other name might smell just as sweet, but would Hermione by any other name seem just as smart? Many years after the last Harry Potter book came out, J.K. Rowling revealed the reason why she had chosen that name for her precocious young witch. It was not in reference to the daughter of Helen of Troy, as I thought it might have been, but rather an allusion to the Queen of Sicily, as told by Shakespeare in The Winter's Tale. Not all her names had insightful backstories. Think of the pedestrian Harry and the uncomplicated Ron. But the names Draco, Lucius, Narcissa, Bellatrix Lestrange, and Severus Snape all bestowed upon the educated reader immediate insights into those characters that might have been less available to the less educated reader. Authors often do this for reasons sometimes obvious and sometimes all their own. I argue in my book, How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass, that something similar was kind of what the original author of what later became the Book of Mormon was going for. Could Nephi, by any other name, be any less credible a writer of Reformed Egyptian? Could Mormon, by any other name, be any less reliable an abridger of ancient history? The answer to both questions is a resounding no. When I started on this journey in 2015, I was surprised to learn that the first instance of Nephi and the first instance of Mormon as person names in all of recorded human history could be traced to a pair of Jesuit priests who, as linguists, in the same decade, 1630 to 1640, pretended to acquire and translate ancient records that they themselves had made up. Nephi and Mormon are perfect characteronyms that the original author, again of what later became the Book of Mormon, used to clearly signal, but only to the most educated linguists and readers, that his more Homeric than historical American Aeneid was just a bit of fun, epic, and biblical fan fiction. But before I go into the backstories of Athanasius Kircher and Pierre de Montmort, I want to give a brief overview of the various Book of Mormon authorship theories that are in play. Let me just say up front that some of what I present today may feel refreshing, exciting, and new. Other parts, however, may be unsettling, especially if you were just getting used to the idea that Joseph Smith had made it all up himself. Some things in life really are that simple, but this is not one of those things. Here, patience, open-mindedness, and a willingness to backtrack on multiple assumptions for longer than you might otherwise be comfortable will be indispensable. First, we have the ancient authorship theory that Native American prophets, like Mormon and Ether, had abridged onto golden plates the histories of the Nephites and the Jaredites, which were later delivered to Joseph Smith in 1827 through supernatural means. In terms of non-supernatural or natural explanations, we have the Smith sole authorship theory that Joseph Smith Jr. single-handedly composed all the sentences in the Book of Mormon through creative writing, automatic writing, or inspired dictation. No version of this theory, as it turned out, was seriously considered for the first 115 years of Mormon history. It is true that some people in 1830, including famous restorationist preachers like Alexander Campbell, before knowing Smith personally, had initially assumed that Smith must have made it all up by himself. However, virtually no one who knew Smith or subsequently came to know Smith, including Campbell, would maintain that Smith had the ability to compose a 590-page spin-off of the Bible. The first sole authorship theory to be taken seriously had Sidney Rigdon at its core, entering the public discourse on February 15, 1831, as published by the Cleveland Advertiser. Even Parley P. Pratt published in 1838 that allegations of Rigdon having authored the Book of Mormon had surfaced in early 1831. When Rigdon came to see Smith in December 1830, probably not for the first time, the two announced that Smith's group would immediately merge with Rigdon's larger and more established church in Kirtland. If it had not been for this merger, there is no doubt that Smith's following would have become as burned over as all the rest that had popped up in that district of New York. As soon as the merger was announced, people started putting two and two together, thus giving birth to the Rigdon sole authorship theory, with Rigdon handing off a finished manuscript to Smith for whatever reason. Many of Rigdon's favorite 19th century doctrines, such as the denunciation of infant baptism, were featured so conspicuously in the Book of Mormon that they left Rigdon with little to no defense. Today there are some who believe that Smith must have received help from his brother Hiram and or from other members of his nuclear family, thus making the construction a family affair, which I call the Smith family collaboration theory. Others assert that Rigdon could not have merely handed off a finished manuscript to Smith. In terms of plot and detail, there must have been significant collaboration between the two, both together and separately, for several years before Smith decided to start dictating it to his scribes. But a wrench is thrown into all these theories because of a man named Solomon Spaulding. In 1832, 1 year after the Rigdon theories began to circulate, missionaries started proselytizing in Conneaut, Ohio, about 50 miles northwest of Kirtland along Lake Erie. As they read from the Book of Mormon, several citizens started attesting that the style of writing, the overall plot, and many specific details, including the proper names of Nephi and Mormon, and several others, had been recited by Spaulding to numerous citizens some 20 years earlier, in people's homes and in public spaces, including temperance taverns. Having nothing to gain financially, having not known Smith personally, and having no obvious motives to lie, all these witnesses affirmed that plagiarism of some kind had occurred. Similar attestations from witnesses in Amity, Pennsylvania, including Spaulding's widow, were also gathered in support of the same conclusion. Consequently, some started to wonder whether Smith had stolen or otherwise obtained some of Spaulding's unpublished writings, which is the Spaulding-Smith theory. Others hypothesized, again starting in 1832, well before E.D. Howe published his Mormonism Unveiled in 1834, that a better explanation was that Spaulding's manuscript had fallen into the hands of Rigdon somehow, and that for whatever reason, Rigdon decided to weave into Spaulding's manuscript some of his doctrines and sermons. And so we must ask, why would he do that? And why would he later involve Smith? Before moving on to the next slide, for completeness, another theory emerged much later than any of these other theories, which is sometimes called the Ethan Smith theory. By the way, Ethan is not related to the Joseph Smith family in any way for at least 6 generations. I'm not going to go into the Ethan Smith theory here, other than to say that both Solomon Spaulding and Ethan Smith had been students at Dartmouth College, with Ethan getting his bachelor's degree in 1790, which was 5 years after Spaulding had received his. All this is to say that the new and revised version of the Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith theory that I present in my book didn't just fall out of a coconut tree. It exists in the context of all of these theories and all that came before it. For most, but not all of this presentation, I'm really only going to entertain these 3 authorship theories. Of course, there are many versions of each theory, which I like to call sub-theories, which are illustrated on the slide with the boxed S. For example, one version of the ancient authorship theory involves a seer stone in a hat, others do not. In some, the plates were delivered by Moroni, in others, Nephi does it. Then there is the debate over the hemispheric model versus the heartland model. Under the assumption of Smith's sole authorship, did he do it in 60 working days, or did he do it quietly over several years? And what was the exact mechanism of Smith's output? Creative writing, automatic writing, or inspired dictation? Under the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory, did Rigdon steal Spalding's manuscript and behave like a villain generally, or was he acting in good faith all along? Did Rigdon and Smith collaborate intensely, meeting often and in secret places over several years, or did Rigdon do substantially all of the heavy lifting himself, including perhaps the rewrite of the lost 116 pages, with Smith adding or changing very little while performatively dictating to his scribes? Finally, did Smith con Rigdon by saying that he had found the cave full of golden plates that Spalding's manuscript had talked about? Or did Smith convince himself that seeing the plates and an angel with his second sight was sufficiently part of the physical world that he didn't feel dishonest when others interpreted his claims in physical terms? The major problems with the ancient authorship theory are that it is internally inconsistent, externally inconsistent, and dynamically inconsistent. And what do I mean? Well, internally, some doctrines, verses, and accounts from the main characters significantly contradict each other. Externally, the Book of Mormon is quite thoroughly refuted by many scientific disciplines, not just genetics, linguistics, anthropology, and archaeology. Dynamically, the stories keep changing. Revelations get rewritten, history is correlated, when not intentionally hidden in a vault, I should add, and members are gaslit when the truth does come out, which also contributes to dynamic inconsistency. The Smith sole authorship theory has its own problems, the two biggest of which, in my opinion, are 1. That it is overly dismissive of data, and 2. That it makes unwarranted assumptions that have gone unchecked. In particular, it dismisses scores of witness statements that point to Spalding and Rigdon's involvement, despite the fact that they are far more credible than the witness statements made by Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, members of the Whitmer clan, and others, which are mutually quite contradictory. It also makes Smith out to be much more intelligent and educated than he ever was. Now, I wasn't born into the Smith sole authorship theory, or the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory for that matter. I had never staked my reputation on either one of them. So in that sense, I didn't have a bias or a prior position to defend. I had nothing to gain or lose with either one supplanting the other. A desire to serve the truth has been my only motive, and this is where the data led me. For the first 100 years of Mormonism, Spalding-Rigdon-Smith subtheories were the only game in town. Unfortunately, for the last 80 years, ever since Fawn Brodie, whose overall contributions were indeed immense and pioneering, sole authorship advocates have succeeded in turning those subtheories into a straw man narrative that was easier to ridicule and dismiss. Before my book, to my knowledge, literally no one had ever tried to steelman a Spalding-Rigdon-Smith subtheory while assuming positive intent on the part of Rigdon. For a long time, we have needed a better narrative. There need not be any conspiracy between Rigdon and Smith. No logistically complex collaboration is required. We can take all the evidence on its face, not dismissing any of it, and we can be consistent about the personalities and attributes of the people involved. Now let's look into that concept just a little bit deeper. Nearly everyone who has believed in the ancient authorship theory, including me as a Mormon missionary in Mexico some 25 years ago, has maintained that Smith was an ignorant farm boy with maybe 6 months of schooling while residing on the Josiah Stoll farm, who didn't have a deceptive bone in his body. By no means was he unintelligent, and what he lacked in the fundamentals he made up for in charisma. Sidney Rigdon had somewhat greater mental acuity, but also some mental instability. He was not as unlearned as Smith, having read many more books, but he had no formal training in critical thinking, history, or theology. Notwithstanding, he became a well-respected restorationist preacher. In all the subtheories under the ancient authorship theory, Rigdon and Smith are very sincere truth seekers who command respect because of how good-natured they are. In other words, they are worthy to be called prophets, seers, and revelators. Under Smith's sole authorship, Smith is all of a sudden much more intelligent and educated than anyone had ever thought. What is the evidence for this? There is none, except perhaps the complexities within the Book of Mormon itself, which logic is dangerously circular. But just because some parts of the Book of Mormon show signs of having been composed by a creative, educated person doesn't mean that Smith was that person. Yes, Smith orally dictated something, either by memory or by reading a hidden manuscript performatively, but that does not mean that he himself composed it. Written composition and oral dictation can be separate and consequential processes. For some, concluding that Smith must have done both at the same time may seem simpler, but it is not necessarily parsimonious. On the fraud scale, Fawn Brodie colored Smith as the continuation of the convicted con man he always was, being fully fraudulent at the beginning and deluding himself into believing that he was a prophet as he went along. Others make Smith out to be a pious fraud, with him believing that he had seen the plates and an angel in his mind, but using misdirection to convince others that the encounters were more physical, going so far in some subtheories as to fashion tin plates and maybe paint them gold, hoping to win over 3 and later 8 witnesses. It is difficult for most, including me, to rationalize how Smith might have been fully pious on the Smith sole authorship theory. Regardless, the profile for Sidney Rigdon is basically unchanged. But something weird happens to Rigdon when moving to the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory. Everyone just assumes that Rigdon now must be a fraudulent, villainous conspirator. This is a failure of creative thinking on the part of all historians, Mormon and non-Mormon, including those who have advocated for the traditional Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory. I, however, assert that the most parsimonious subtheory within the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory, and overall, involves Rigdon having the same pious character that everyone assumes that he has under the other theories. For completeness, these other 3 blue stars show how I characterize Smith on these dimensions. I don't assume that Smith is more educated than we have evidence for, and my theory is as generous to Smith and even as kind as the data will allow. Now let me give a brief background on Solomon Spalding as necessary context for building what I think is a more parsimonious subtheory. Solomon Spalding was hardworking, intelligent, and well-educated at Dartmouth College, where he received theological training beyond the normal undergraduate courses. For the good part of a decade, he lived among the Native Americans as a Dartmouth missionary, trying to convert them to Christianity, or more accurately, trying to convince them that they were already part of the House of Israel through the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel, which was the staunch belief of Eleazar Wheelock, Dartmouth's first president. After 10 years, Spalding rejected organized religion altogether and became a bit of an atheist, or at least a deist. Something of a romantic at heart, he aspired to write an American Aeneid, the first great all-American novel that would at once explain the linguistic and religious origins of the Native Americans whom he had served. Calling his magnum opus Manuscripts Found, it would contain several similar and nested storylines connecting the present day to the Garden of Eden by way of romantic vignettes. A partial rough draft of the first vignette is now on display at Oberlin College. The first vignette would not be written in the scriptural style of the King James Version of the Bible, because that wouldn't make sense based on the plot, but the second and third would be, because that would make sense based on the plot. The second and third vignettes eventually become the plot-heavy backbone of the Book of Mormon. Unfortunately, Spalding died in 1816, after which the printer's copy of Manuscripts Found languished within a Pittsburgh print shop for approximately 8 years. When the establishment went bankrupt, Sidney Rigdon, a restorationist preacher who had supplied book bindings to the print shop, received the manuscripts innocently without being a thief, along with other assets during the liquidation. He believed that the Nephi Mormon and Jared Ether vignettes within manuscripts found were indeed ancient American scripture, just as Spalding had intended. Rigdon believed that God had chosen him specifically, on account of his faith and righteousness, to restore this and even more ancient American scripture. The text said of itself that not even 100th part of the manuscript had been translated into what Rigdon was holding in his hands, and that there was a cave full of more golden scripture just waiting to be found. In time, Rigdon may have confided in his assistant, Parley P. Pratt, who had lived in Palmyra in 1825 with his uncles, Ira and Allen Pratt, just before moving to the Western Reserve of Ohio, where he was subsequently converted to Rigdon's restored church. Pratt told Rigdon about how Joseph Smith had the reputation for being able to find precious objects that had been buried in the earth using a seer stone that would shine with a spiritual light when placed at the bottom of his top hat. In this subtheory, Rigdon was skeptical but believing and proactively looking for people with restored spiritual gifts. Rigdon reasoned that God had put Smith onto Pratt's path and Pratt onto Rigdon's own path because that's what God does when people like Rigdon are trying to fully live his restored gospel. Again, in this subtheory, Rigdon fasted and prayed until he convinced himself that he had received a confirmation from God that Smith was to be trusted. Of course, it is possible that Smith, as a well-practiced con man, tried to con Rigdon out of his manuscript so that he might publish it under his own name for filthy lucre's sake. That may have been Smith's desire from the beginning, which he as much admits, but over time, in my opinion, Smith's actions may have evolved into something less avaricious. He had no education to speak of, very limited critical thinking skills, and a very magical worldview that he had inherited from both his parents. More likely, in my view, Rigdon convinced Smith to repent, have a mighty change of heart, and embrace a full restoration so that he might fully develop his spiritual gift of seership and use it for righteous purposes instead of trying to get rich off the plates or off the manuscript. Smith believed that the golden plates were material precisely because Sidney Rigdon did. In short order, they became real to Smith and to his scribes and witnesses because that's what happens when you prematurely testify of something that you see in your mind, wanting it to be true, and so it becomes true to you. When Smith said that he could see the plates in his stone and the translation of the characters engraved upon them, Rigdon frankly believed him, as readily as did so many others. Without coercion, Rigdon gave his finished manuscript to Smith, believing that if Smith saw the same words appear in his stone, then the same would be taken as a confirmation and a ratification. Out of the mouths of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. Yes, Smith had to use some folk magic and misdirection, especially to convince Martin Harris to be his financier, so he wasn't fully pious, but perhaps something more pious than your run-of-the-mill pious fraud, in my opinion. Now, the details surrounding this new and improved subtheory can be explained quite reasonably and parsimoniously, for which, if you want to slowly consume my careful, though admittedly imperfect explanations, I would refer you to my book. Again, no conspiracy is required. Copious evidence need not be dismissed in the name of collective mass memory distortion, as Dan Vogel likes to call it. Unlike sole authorship theories, we don't have to make unwarranted assumptions about Smith's intelligence and education, making him out to be a world-class expert on Hebraisms, classical literature, archaisms, New World anthropology, Isaiah, the King James Version of the Bible, and all the controversies of 19th century Christology at the tender age of 22, without any education, relevant experience, direct exposure to Native American living, or theological training, all of which Solomon Spaulding had in spades. Now let's line up all the subtheories out there and ask ourselves where we think we are. Most Brighamite Mormons start out here in dark purple. I'll say that Terrell Givens' version is in orange, Richard Bushman's version is in green, and Blake Ostler's expansion theory is in gray. If you're not familiar with that last one, he argued that Joseph Smith translated some Reformed hieroglyphs into the backbone of the Book of Mormon and then expanded that text with his own 19th century ideas. When most ex-Mormons deconstruct, they usually start here, in blue, at the fully fraudulent end of the fraud spectrum for Smith. They find out that he was not only a rock-and-a-hat con man, but also a 40-wife polygamist and polyandrist, and that's enough. Indeed, this was essentially Fawn Brody's position, that Smith was in the role of a con man while composing the Book of Mormon all by himself, and only later came to think of himself as a true prophet after quite a bit of leader worship. Dan Vogel takes a more nuanced view, with Smith being a pious fraud, which has relative merit, but only in this neighborhood, where again, evidence is dismissed all too easily and unchecked assumptions are made in the name of simplicity. My new and very different Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith subtheory is here in yellow at the pious end of Rigdon's fraud spectrum. Because no Mormon historian and no non-Mormon Mormon historian has ever tried to steelman a Rigdon pious version of the Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith theory, criticisms derived from other subtheories in this category need to be temporarily suspended and re-evaluated against this new subtheory, which hasn't been done yet. If you are familiar with the Spaulding Fable, a satire written by John Hamer that he published on the blog By Common Consent, you'll find it here in blue. Now let us ask ourselves what data would best distinguish or discriminate between the various subtheories. In the parlance of an organic chemist, which is my training, what experiments, natural or theoretical, would be capable of strongly discounting some mechanisms at the expense of others? By way of history, before the human genome was mapped, believing Mormons held out hope that New World genetic evidence might support ancient authorship subtheories at the expense of all others. When technology advanced far enough to actually run that thought experiment, however, the opposite turned out to be the case. No living or dead subpopulations of North or South America show any signs of a pre-Columbian infusion of Semitic DNA to any extent. That thought experiment is over. But here's another thought experiment. Suppose we were to find a long-lost diary belonging to Solomon Spaulding, or perhaps Professor John Smith, revealing the reason why he had picked the names Nephi and Mormon for two of his main characters. Such a discovery would favor both Spaulding and Spaulding-Rigdon-Smith's subtheories while taking something away from all the others. At this point, it is not likely that we will find such evidence, but it is theoretically possible. Over the past couple of decades, several scholars have noted that traces of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and even Macpherson's Ossian all exist in the Book of Mormon. This was something problematic under the ancient authorship theory. It was also a problem for Smith's sole authorship subtheories until some of its advocates, behaving more like apologists than historians, simply declared that Smith must have been a lover of classical literature and very well read on Homer and Virgil. How else could those memes have ended up in the Book of Mormon? How else indeed? In other words, they solved the problem, in air quotes, by moving the goalposts as touching Smith's education, which is a fallacy motivated by a bias, and we mustn't do that. Neither is there any evidence that anyone in the Smith family was classically trained enough to be able to incorporate subtle allusions from the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, or Ossian. It is also unlikely that Rigdon would have been able to do so, but more importantly, why would he do so? That would undermine his purpose under the Rigdon sole authorship theory. Both Spalding and Ethan Smith, however, were classically educated such that they would have had no problem introducing those Homerisms, for lack of a better term, into the Book of Mormon. It's patently obvious why Spalding would add them to his fiction as a Bible burlesquing atheist who loved to tell stories and had been the principal of the Cherry Valley Academy, which was the first classical school in the United States west of Albany. Ethan Smith, to our knowledge, never wrote fiction. In any event, lacing a secular Native American religious history with intentional influences from fictional Greek literature would have undermined his purposes as well. On to the last thought experiment. Consider all the cool Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon, like Nahum, the rivers of water, Iriantum, and the quirky deviations from the Law of Moses. Consider all the archaic constructions, not just from early Middle English, like, and after that I prayed, instead of, and after I prayed, etc. And what about all the very creative riffing on the King James Version of the Bible, not just the wholesale copying of certain chapters? Such observations are more likely to have been incorporated by Spalding or Ethan Smith, each of whom had studied Hebrew under Professor John Smith in the 1780s at Dartmouth, who was one of the best Hebrew scholars in the United States for over 30 years. Rigdon would have been far less capable compared to Spalding and Ethan, but far more capable than Joseph Smith. But here again, sole authorship enthusiasts move the goalposts and unjustifiably rush to aggrandize the overall intellectual and educational profile for Joseph Smith. But is there a set of observations in the Book of Mormon where sole authorship apologists simply cannot get away with moving the goalposts again? In other words, are there details in the Book of Mormon that could not have been put there by Joseph Smith? And for that matter, are there details that could not have been put there by Sidney Rigdon? If so, then those portions at least were not written by them, but by someone else. I submit to you that the answer to those questions is yes, and that the best person for introducing those specific details into the Book of Mormon was Solomon Spalding, having been educated by Professor John Smith. In my book, I call these new details Kircherisms. They have to do with the famous German Jesuit priest whose name was Athanasius Kircher. The entire first chapter is devoted to understanding his life and works, but if you're interested in really appreciating who he was, these are the best books that I would recommend that you learn from. First and foremost is Athanasius Kircher's Theater of the World by Jocelyn Godwin. Then comes Athanasius Kircher, The Last Man Who Knew Everything by Paula Finland at Stanford University. Finally, I also highly recommend Daniel Stolzenberg's Egyptian Oedipus, Athanasius Kircher, and the Secrets of Antiquity. The most important thing to know about Kircher, for the purpose of today's discussion, is that he pretended to have found a mysterious manuscript ostensibly written by a part Jewish, part Egyptian linguist/historian whose supposed name was Nephi, Rabbi Berechius Nephi of Babylon, to be precise. Nearly all Kircher scholars today conclude that Kircher had made Nephi up, that neither he nor his source text actually existed. Now, why would Kircher fabricate such an interesting source? But before I explain why, I'll say that several other details from the life and works of Athanasius Kircher, not just the name Nephi, are particularly relevant to Mormon history. Of necessity, I will have to be relatively brief during this time slot, but if you want to get the full picture on Athanasius Kircher, who was without question one of the world's most popular and then forgotten men from the 1600s, then you're going to have to read some books. So who was this Egyptian Oedipus, the last man who knew everything? Kircher was born in 1601 near Fulda, Germany. He was the youngest of 9 children, and his parents raised him to one day become a priest. He was named after St. Athanasius, who had been exiled to Germany from the Holy See of Alexandria in the 4th century by Constantine, a date that's going to become important later. Eventually, Kircher became a Jesuit. Now, if you think that Mormon persecution was bad, and sometimes it truly was, it was nothing compared to what was happening to Jesuits during the 30 Years' War in Germany. Beyond being tarred and feathered, many were viciously tortured, raped, and inhumanely killed. Kircher applied for a transfer out of Germany, but it was denied. At the time, Kircher was stationed in Mainz, where, incidentally, the Gutenberg Bible had first been printed. There he was exposed to some old texts, like Hohenberg's Thesaurus Hieroglyphicum, which exposure gave him an idea. You see, the Vatican had all these obelisks, which of course had hieroglyphic engravings that the Jesuits in Rome could not decipher. Some believed that the symbols were pagan, others thought that they held ancient wisdom and even Adamic magic. Kircher reasoned that if he could figure out some of the characters, then he would get transferred to Rome, which was safer, more intellectual, and more prestigious. After a couple of years, he announced that he had reconstructed an intermediate Egyptian language using the clues from Nephi's manuscript as a guide. His ruse succeeded, and he was transferred to Collegio Romano, where he served as professor of the Oriental languages. Pressured to publish or perish, he produced Prodromus Coptus, which means the forerunner of Coptic, which he said was halfway between ancient hieroglyphs and modern Coptic. Now, Kircher didn't use the word Reformed Egyptian because Kircher didn't speak English, but that is clearly what he was going for. Prodromus Coptus was the first of 3 keys to unlocking the Egyptian language, which fortuitously gave him decades of job security. In 1643, he published Lingua Egyptiaca Restituta, which he upheld as, quote, a complete translation of his Coptic Arabic manuscript, close quote, which again Nephi had supposedly written. In 1652, he published Oedipus Egyptiacus, which he himself said was, quote, a complete restoration of the hieroglyphic doctrine and of all the lost secrets of religion, close quote. At this point, we can start to assemble a list of Kircherisms that appear in the Book of Mormon. As we make the list, we can ask ourselves questions about how and why these Kircherisms got into what eventually became the Book of Mormon. Nephi, of course, is at the top of the list. He is, after all, the first main character in the Book of Mormon. Like Kircher's Nephi, the prophet Nephi has mixed cultural heritage. He is a Jew from Jerusalem who speaks Hebrew, but for some reason can write in Reformed Egyptian, which is the next Kircherism. In the story, for 1,000 years, one or maybe a couple of people in each generation somehow learn this dead language and pass it down without degradation until Mormon engraves his golden plates again in Reformed Egyptian. I submit to you that the name Nephi is an intentional and very clever signal to the highly educated reader that the scripture-sounding religious history of the Native Americans is pure fiction all along. The word Nephi is an extremely well-chosen name under theories that involve Solomon Spaulding, for whom we have historical accounts saying that Spaulding intended to write a Bible burlesquing fiction explaining where the Native Americans might have come from. And those accounts specifically recall that they had heard Spaulding recite the names Nephi and Mormon some 25 years before Mormon missionaries arrived in Conneaut, Ohio. In contrast, the word Nephi is a horribly chosen name under the Smith sole authorship subtheories because, as an anachronism, it would undermine the text's claim to being ancient scripture. Here is another Kircherism. Throughout Kircher's lifetime, the Catholic Church was religiously imperializing parts of New Spain, in other words, modern-day Mexico, and missionaries there were sending back to Kircher codices from the Aztecs and the Mayans with the hope that he and other Jesuits would be able to translate the writings of those cultures. We now know today that Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Mayan, the language of the Mayan people, are quite distinct and had evolved independently for over 1,000 years from the Uto-Aztecan core. However, Kircher didn't know that. He believed that all the Native American engravings, and even Chinese characters, had evolved from the same ancient Egyptian writing system. Consequently, people were expecting Kircher to make headway in those languages as well, and so, to keep his reputation going, he layered on yet another lie. After, quote, devoting himself to the study of Mexican gods and codices kept in the Jesuit collections at the Colegio Romano, Kircher boasted that he had rediscovered the message of Christianity in the hieroglyphic writings of the Chinese and the Aztecs, close quote. So that is the third Kircherism on our list. The central purpose of the Book of Mormon, according to its title page, is to restore to the Native Americans their long-lost religious history, that they might rediscover the message of Christianity in the hieroglyphic writings of their ancestors, with Jesus Christ showing himself to them after his resurrection. This next Kircherism is my favorite. Another thing that made Kircher famous was his theory of spiritual magnetism, which was the subject of his doctoral thesis, for which he earned the highest degree of the pontifical system, or Sacrae Theologiae Doctor. In short, Kircher believed that electric and magnetic forces were physical manifestations of an intrinsic spiritual force. Interestingly enough, some scientists even credit Kircher with coining the term electromagnetism, which of course we still use today. He wrote multiple books on the subject, with this one, Magnes Sife de Arte Magnetica, clocking in at 900 pages, with more than 150 woodcuts and 32 full-page engraved plates. For Kircher, magnetism was both an indication and a radiation of spiritual energy, which he taught could vary from day to day as a function of personal righteousness. He even concluded that spiritual electromagnetism was the mechanism by which the Apostle Peter repelled Earth's magnetic field and thus was able to walk on water, that is, until his faith wavered. To further demonstrate his rather forced pseudoscientific principle, he produced hundreds of balls of curious workmanship, which he then displayed in his Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Wonders, and later on the colossal shelves of his Museo Kircheriano, which is shown on the rightmost part of this slide. Of Kircher's museum, Kern Vermeer said, quote, "It was a place where his collection was shown and demonstrated to the courtly visitors. It was a tourist attraction for those visiting Rome, and many prominent figures from all over the world were lured into paying Kircher a visit. Even the instruments with a practical utility were now embedded in a context of Baroque spectacle in which natural objects, artifacts, texts, and images were employed for the divertisement of the public. Kircher even staged real shows, which were so amazing that he was sometimes accused of sorcery," close quote. And here is a quote from Jocelyn Godwin, quote, "Glass globes contain Kircher's favorite device of magnetized pointing figures, which rotate as though by magic, but actually because a magnet is turning the column beneath them. Once he had found that a figure suspended inside a glass globe could be turned by an unseen magnet. The stage magician in him took over." This slide contains a small sample of Kircher's balls of curious workmanship. Notice how all of them feature some kind of pointer, usually suspended by a thin silk thread. Notice further how all the human and angelic pointers are also carrying a spindle, which, after spinning around for a while, ends up pointing to letters, numbers, or symbols that appear on the sides of the globe. So, at the museum, a patron would walk up to an exhibit, hold one of the glass balls in his hands, and charge it up with his spiritual energy. Then, quote, "The visitor is invited to ask some question about the signs of the zodiac, planets, winds, or the system by which the date of Easter is calculated. By pulling a string, the operator then causes a hidden magnet to revolve, in turn causing the figures in the globes to point their spindles to the answer," close quote. In other words, if you are in need of guidance or revelation, these glass and brass balls could reveal it to you according to their faith and righteousness, not unlike a magic 8-ball today. Incidentally, Kircher concluded that the obelisk itself was a spiritual needle pointing to heaven. In one of the quotes that he made up and attributed to his fictitious Nephi, he called the obelisks the needles of Pharaoh. Moreover, each of his exhibits had a very religious object lesson. Just as the needle of a magnetic compass aligns itself with the magnetic field of the earth in order to be useful, so too must we, as spiritual needles ourselves, align our bodies and minds with God, that we might absorb his power and be useful to others while making their journey through life. A truly beautiful thought that in some sense came from a con man who spent the rest of his life trying to do better despite the temptations of fame and absolute power. Just a little food for thought. The second exhibit was more like a magnetic telegraph, where a visitor would go to the ball on the left and turn it so that the spindle would point to a specific letter written on the side of the globe. Then, with enough spiritual energy charging up that first globe, the information would be communicated seemingly ethereally from globe to globe to the opposite end of the exhibit. Of course, hidden pulleys would make sure that the letters would match, and hidden magnets would give the overall exhibit a special magical feeling. I provide several more examples in my book, but these two, I think, have special significance. On the exhibit on the left, the visitor would spiritually charge up the brass ball on the right by holding it in his hands, which would cause the spindle in the left globe, which was made of glass, not brass, to point to a number. In reality, the body heat of the patron's hands would change the pressure of the connected air chamber beneath it, which would then pump water through a thin straw to a reservoir, thus powering a water wheel, driving a crank, turning a magnet, and consequently changing the readout of the spindle. The system on the right is more allegorical than functional. Whenever the wind would change its direction, the weather vane would turn an axle, which, in combination with the clock face, would rotate a concealed bar magnet, thus spinning the pointer above it such that the spindle would rest on a different icon etched into the sides of the round ball. His object lesson was this, more or less. When making a voyage across life's wind-tossed seas, signified by the literal ship in the background, one needs to consider more than just the time of day and the direction of the wind. We must also incorporate other forces that we cannot see but feel must be there, like the spiritually magnetic force of God. If you are aligned with him, then your spiritually magnetic compass inside of you will work properly, and you will be guided to safe shores and to a land of promise. Wherefore, the fourth Kircherism in the Book of Mormon is pretty straightforward. Lehi, Nephi's father, is miraculously given a spiritually magnetic compass, which is a spherical ball made of brass that has pointers, spindles, and writing on its sides. It only works when its holder, usually Nephi, maintains a state of personal righteousness. This idea is clearly based on Kircher's concept of spiritual magnetism. The fifth Kircherism is fairly minor in comparison to the above four, but it is worth mentioning. In real life, when publishing a book in the 1600s, the mere images of its illustrations would be engraved into printing plates. Pure copper printing plates were brown like a penny, but would oxidize when repeatedly exposed to both air and iron gall ink, forming a greenish patina. Think of the Statue of Liberty, just quickly enough to become a nuisance for the printers, which discoloration you can see a little bit on this printing plate here. For large print run productions, which most of Kircher's books were, it was important to alloy the molten copper with 10 to 15% zinc, because doing so would significantly slow the oxidation process. Such brass plates often had a reddish hue and consequently were sometimes called red brass plates, but more often just brass plates. Interestingly enough, when alloyed with enough zinc, between 20 and 30%, they would take on a lustrous yellow sheen. Golden plates were more expensive in the printing process compared to rudimentary brass plates because zinc ores were harder to find, mine, and smelt in those days. As a result, they were reserved for more precious, larger volume productions. During his lifetime, Kircher commissioned over 400 golden brass plates, more than any other author in history. Onto one such plate was engraved the image of Fabius Chisius, who was one of Kircher's chief benefactors and supporters throughout his life. They first met on a trip to Malta in 1637. There, Kircher famously lowered himself, with nothing but a rope around his waist, into Mount Vesuvius, which only 6 years earlier had erupted and buried an entire village. When Fabius became the head of the Catholic Church, he changed his name to Pope Alexander VII. Fabius, as it turns out, is also the name of the main character in the first of Spalding's vignettes. In terms of our list of Kircherisms, in the story, Nephi makes use of brass and golden plates, chiseling into them the untold religious history of the New World going back to the Tower of Babel. And now for this presentation's sixth and final Kircherism. It turns out that there was another Jesuit priest and professor of Oriental languages who was also making up his sources in the 1630s. In the same way that Nephi is a disguised reference to Kircher, Mormon is another subtle clue that gives away the fiction. This man here, the one standing in a cauldron, is Mormon. In all of history and literature, he is the first and only person to bear that name before the Book of Mormon came upon the scene. This illustration is a political cartoon of sorts, which served as the frontispiece of a book of fiction that was published in 1650 with the title Le Parasite Mormon, Histoire Comique, Mormon the Parasite, a Comic History. In the opening scene, Mormon, the main character in the book, is to be burned at the stake for being an atheist, a homosexual, and a cannibal. The book is written as a burlesque novel, poking fun of Mormon for being a hypocrite and a liar, which sentiment is echoed in the frontispiece. Notice how he is standing in a cauldron, lecturing the chefs in the room on how to prepare himself so that he can be served as his own last meal. It turns out that the Mormon in the story is a caricature of another real-life Jesuit priest and professor of Oriental languages. This second Jesuit was fired from his faculty appointment with the University of Paris and then excommunicated from the Jesuit order precisely because he got caught writing pseudepigrapha, which he had tried to pass off as if they were genuine ancient texts, mostly in Greek. In some sense, Monmor, the first Mormon, was also the first Mark Hoffman. He did so by constructing, quote, obscene ancient literary forms, which today we might call chiasmus, and spending whole days toying with onomastics and anagrams, close quote. The name of this Jesuit was Pierre de Monmor. Here I need to explain something peculiar about French culture and literature. In French, it is a fun practice to invert a two-syllable word such that the second syllable goes first, especially if that new word has some clever relationship to the original word, whether that be a synonym, an antonym, a pun, or something else. Nowadays, we call this practice verlan, which itself is the inverse of the French word for inverse, or l'envers. In this case, Mormon is the verlan of Monmor. In the introduction to Le Parasite Mormon, François de Lemoutre-Louvayer, the primary author, explained that he constructed Mormon for several reasons. One reason was because Mormon was also the name of the monstrous in Greek mythology that snatches misbehaving children, sucks their blood, and or devours their bodies, like any good cannibal. Another reason was to obscure Monmor's name just enough to avoid any legal action from the rich and powerful Monmor family. The full story is discussed in Chapter 14. And that completes our list of 6 Kircherisms. As I'm sure everyone listening to this knows, Mormon is the eponymous prophet historian who serves as the chief custodian and compiler of the large plates of Nephi, which in the story get abridged and etched onto the golden plates of Mormon, again somehow in Reformed Egyptian. The first and last bookending characters in the Book of Mormon are unmistakable allusions to Athanasius Kircher and Pierre de Monmor. Both individuals made up their sources, wrote pseudepigrapha, and tried to get away with it. Nephi and Mormon are probably the most perfect names that you could choose if your purpose was to write something that, on one level, the uneducated masses might accept as ancient American scripture, while, on another level, only the most educated historians and linguists would recognize as faux pseudepigrapha. What do I mean by faux pseudepigrapha? Well, basic pseudepigrapha happens when an author composes new content as if he were an earlier historical figure, writing in the earlier figure's name and from his or her point of view. In this case, however, Nephi and Mormon were not actual historical figures. They were non-historical characters that pointed to real-life men who had written pseudepigrapha. Consequently, writing an American Aeneid using their names and from their point of view is very clever and brimming with literary irony. Who could compose such layered fiction, and more importantly, why would that person write such layered fiction? Now would be a good time to ask ourselves how these 6 Kircherisms might cause us to think differently about the subtheories that have been proposed, and maybe even think up a new subtheory that is even better. I'm guessing that the leadership of the Brighamite sect is going to ignore the Kircherisms as long as it can, but maybe they will someday make it into one of the gospel topic essays. I'm interested to see what kind of apologetics Terrell Givens and Richard Bushman create to try to explain them under their versions of the ancient authorship theory. In terms of the Smith sole authorship theory, unfortunately, Brodie is no longer with us to weigh in. However, if she were alive today, I honestly think that she would accept the Kircherisms at face value and eventually land somewhere in the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory. But what about current sole authorship advocates? Relatively soon, they are going to have to divide themselves into one of 2 camps based on whether they see the Kircherisms in the Book of Mormon as coincidental or intentional. I suspect that some will try to dismiss them as coincidental or even parallelomania, but I don't think that is where the academic consensus is going to end up. Over the years, I have spoken with multiple professors in academia, including Mormons, non-Mormons, and post-Mormons, about these 6 Kircherisms. All of them assure me that they are not parallelomania. The proposition that someone deliberately put them into a text that ultimately became the Book of Mormon is a scholarly hypothesis I have been assured. Whether it turns out to be right or wrong, the proposition is orders of magnitude more significant than Nahum, one of them said, and think about how many hundreds of pages and posts have been written on that topic. To be transparent, not all of them have agreed with my conclusion that Spalding was the one who put them there, but so far they have all agreed that the Kircherisms, if intentional and not coincidental, demand an explanation. Could Joseph Smith have put in the Kircherisms himself? The probability of that scenario is extremely low, and here's why. Although Kircher was world famous during his lifetime, 150 years later, in rural America, he was almost unheard of. He was certainly not a part of the milieu of Palmyra, New York during the 1820s. I challenge anyone to find even one book, newspaper article, or journal entry that mentions Kircher's Nephi, his spiritually magnetic compass, his Reformed Egyptian language, his message of Christianity among the Aztecs, or his fellow Jesuit Pierre de Monmort. Kircher does not prominently appear in anything that Smith would have had access to, which has been studied extensively. There are footnotes in some academic sources, which again Smith would not have had access to, that quote Kircher here and there, usually to point out an inconsistency or some gross error on Kircher's part. But I guarantee none of the 6 Kircherisms are there. I've looked very carefully. Whoever was this deep on Kircher must have been a professor of Oriental languages at Dartmouth College or its equivalent, or a graduate student of the same. In short, it is nigh impossible for Smith to have had enough exposure to Kircher to integrate the Kircherisms intelligently and creatively into his own fiction, especially not at the tender age of 22, again, with virtually no schooling, having a reputation for being idle and indolent, being, quote, far less interested in the perusal of books than any of her other children, according to Lucy Mack Smith, and having roamed the countryside for years searching for buried treasure. That he somehow obtained a manuscript that contained the Kircherisms, unbeknownst to him, is far more likely. Nevertheless, for the time being, if we were to temporarily stipulate Smith as the sole author of the Book of Mormon, for the sake of argument, then somehow he must have been quite familiar with Kircher's life and works. Even if we cannot identify how that could have been the case, we must ask the following critical question. Why would Smith include such specific, memorable, and undermining Kircherisms in a book that he intended to present as both scripture and ancient history? Did he initially set out to write fiction with clever proper nouns like Hermione or Severus Snape, and only much later decide to recast his narrative as nonfiction? If so, at some point, it might have been too late to remove or obscure the Kircherisms, having spoken to others about some of the details according to multiple accounts. If Smith worried that his most educated readers might identify the Kircherisms, thereby betraying the work as fiction, he did nothing to manage that risk. On the other hand, Smith might have been confident that no one else would pick up on the Kircherisms. If so, why did he think that they wouldn't? If Kircherisms had been accessible to Smith, again for the sake of argument, then especially given his lack of literary acquirements, it stands to reason that they would have been accessible to nearly everyone. And if they were so generally accessible, which they weren't, it is highly improbable that no one else would have recognized them. And if someone did, why did no one write about them in diaries, journals, or newspapers? Such a missed opportunity surely would have been exploited by one of Smith's many detractors, especially given the volume of discrediting and disparaging statements that were made against Smith and his family. I contend that this is the more parsimonious path for how Kircherisms ended up in the Book of Mormon. Indeed, it stretches the imagination past the ripping point to envision a scenario in which Smith might have convinced himself, after somehow learning that Kircher invented one Nephi, one spiritually magnetic compass, and one reformed Egyptian language, that an entirely unrelated ancient Nephi, literally, not figuratively, sailed to America, aided by a completely separate spiritually magnetic compass, and wrote about it coincidentally in reformed Egyptian. If Smith did earnestly believe this, then it would seem that he must have suffered, at best, from dream-reality confusion, and at worst, from some delusional disorder. For those of you who are interested in diving deeper into this subject, I think that you will find, after reading my book and going down the rabbit hole of footnotes, that everything makes much more sense under my new Rigdon Pius version of the very old Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory. So here is my call to action. Help me make this theory better. Please send your questions, comments, and constructive criticisms to my email address shown on the screen. You can also give me feedback through my website at www.howthebookofmormoncametopass.com, where you can also find links for buying the book, the ebook, and the audiobook, which I narrated myself. Please share my work with others who may be interested. Together, let's try to bring more interdisciplinary skills into the field of Mormon history. There is a lot more to discover on this and other topics, but please do not share my work with active Mormons unless you know that they have a robust support system outside of the Mormon Church. If you'd like to donate to my research, you can also do that through my website. I apologize for not leaving more time for questions at the end, but do email them to me regardless. I enjoy taking the time to compose thoughtful responses. And with that, thank you for your presence and for your attention. At the end of the presentation, I entertained questions during the lunch hour for about an hour and 10 minutes. I cannot remember all of them, but here are a few that I remember that I wanted to share. My answers here are not the same as what I gave in person because I have a faulty memory and decided to do a better job of answering them here. Question number 1. Most people say that the Book of Mormon was an oral composition. Why don't you think it was? Answer. There is ample witness testimony that Joseph Smith dictated the book orally to his scribes. That is true. There is also some textual evidence that he dictated the book orally to his scribes. For example, Smith corrected himself on one occasion saying, "They buried the weapons of peace," or "they buried their weapons of war for peace." But just because a few places show signs of going through a late-stage oral process does not mean that there couldn't have been an earlier stage writing process. There usually is. Written composition and oral dictation are not mutually exclusive. There is more than enough textual evidence indicating that the book had been composed in written form before it was performatively dictated. I contend that it was fully composed by Spalding and Rigdon and then handed off to Smith, who orally dictated it, making a few mistakes and opportunistic additions, but probably not amounting to more than 1% or 2% of the total content. Question number 2. Why is the subtitle of your book The Second Greatest Show on Earth? Answer. While writing the book, I had the distinct thought that Athanasius Kircher had been, in some sense, the world's greatest showman, at least in his century, and that Joseph Smith had likewise been the greatest showman in his century. Consequently, I almost opted for the title The Two Greatest Showmen, with a hat tip to a great musical that happened to come out during my research. Instead, I decided to give a hat tip to one of my favorite books, The Greatest Show on Earth, which, if you don't know, is Richard Dawkins' masterful treatise on the evidence for evolution by natural selection. As a scientist myself, I spent much of my early adult life compartmentalizing science and religion as if they were two non-overlapping magisteria. I had grown up with the idea that the work of the Latter-day Saints in preparing the world for the Second Coming was the greatest show on earth, and that everything else was just a distraction and literally a sideshow. However, because in some sense I wrote this book for my children, I wanted to let them know, in the afterword, that watching them grow into the fine, intelligent, and lovely ladies that they are has been, for me, the greatest show on earth. Now I would say that science, despite its majesty, religion, despite its utility, and history, despite its greatest showmen, are all competing to be nothing more than the second greatest show on earth. Question number 3 comes from the Whova app, which was submitted by someone during the session itself. Hi Lars, thank you for all your great work. I wanted to ask why the story of Ammon, likely stemming from the image you found in Oedipus Egyptiacus, is not classified as a Kircherism. It had a huge impact on me as I read your book. Answer. Thank you for the compliment and for asking this question. I'm glad to hear that the Ammon Oedipus Egyptiacus observation struck you in a similar way that it impacted me. In the book, I decided to hold this particular Kircherism until late in the book for essentially 2 reasons. One, it takes a lot more time to explain it than the others, not wanting to go on too long of a tangent so early in the book. And 2, I thought it was a good opportunity to showcase the idea in the context of updating one's prior probabilities based on new information. I wanted to talk about it during my presentation, but I chose not to because it was already up to the full hour. I will plan to give it higher priority in future presentations based on your feedback. Much appreciated. Question number 4 is also from the Whova app. Reports via Joseph H. Jackson said Smith told him the origin was at Dartmouth. Is there any evidence of what the older professor was teaching there, especially the common themes involving the lost 10 tribes of Israel being represented by Native Americans? Answer. I assume that you're referring to Joseph H. Jackson's statement in the Warsaw Signal. If you meant something else, please let me know. Jackson's relationship was complicated, trustful, distrustful, protective, and violent. One might call it a thug-mobster relationship. At one point, Jackson claimed that Smith confided that the Book of Mormon was a humbug and that the original was written by Lyman Spalding. Unfortunately, neither Jackson nor Smith were very credible at this point, and each deliberately sowed discrediting information and or misinformation about the other. I think it is possible that Smith eventually tried to figure out where the parent text for the Book of Mormon came from, and may have concluded that it came from Dartmouth and or Spalding. He may or may not have confided something to that effect to Jackson. If he did, it is possible that Jackson misremembered the first name of Spalding, or Joseph did, or. Wish we knew more about that. Question number 5. Why did you not publish this first in scholarly journals? Why do you sometimes have a polemical tone in your book? Why do you speculate that Solomon Spalding was a homosexual? First, let me say that in my book, I quote historians who suggest that Solomon Spalding was, more probably than not, a closeted homosexual. It isn't my speculation. Second, I admit that part of my faith deconstruction involved phases where I felt anger, denial, and loss. As you know, because you, Bryce, read the book carefully and gave me over 300 suggestions for improving the book, for which I am very grateful, that my book was never designed to be a textbook of history. I am not a historian, nor an amateur historian, nor have I ever pretended to be such. I did not write the book for historians or to historians. I wrote the book for me, as part of my deconstruction and healing process, and for my children, so they could know some of the thoughts and research that I had conducted in trying to make sense of how the Book of Mormon came to pass. I shared it with others, and they encouraged me to share it with others. In the end, I chose to insert myself into my book for 3 reasons. 1, I decided to embrace and even honor the thoughts and feelings that I had in my journey, including the polarizing feelings. 2, I wanted to spark and renew interest in the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory, hoping that others would see things that I might have missed. And 3, in an exercise to better understand Solomon Spalding and how he inserted himself into his fictional writings, including the Romance of Celeste, the Fabius story within manuscripts found, and in the Book of Mormon, I wrote some parts of my book in the same playful tone and contrarian style that he exhibited. In terms of your first question, as you heard from my presentation, I did go out to Mormon and non-Mormon professors more than 2 years before I published the book. I specifically asked for help getting this work into scholarly journals first. I sent them copies of my book. I met with them on Zoom calls for several hours. They assured me that my hypothesis, that Nephi and Mormon might have been intentional proper names that alluded to Athanasius Kircher, was scholarly and not parallelomania. I asked them to take the ideas and flesh them out in academic venues first, with or without my involvement. John Turner specifically encouraged me to present last year at Sunstone 2023 and or at the Mormon History Association annual conference. Unfortunately, I had already missed both of those deadlines. I also spoke with Patrick Mason. Both promised to network me to individuals who would be willing to take my research to the next level. I think that each of them did put out some honest effort, but in the end they fizzled out and said that this was my discovery, and as such, that I should flesh it out myself. It wouldn't be quite fair to say that they ghosted me, but that was the gist of it. Question 6. We have been given some evidence that scholars at BYU borrowed materials from Dartmouth College through the interlibrary loan system, kept the materials, and refused to give them back. They reportedly were banned for a period of time from fully using the interlibrary loan system and paid millions of dollars in fines. Have you heard about this? And could it be related to the materials that you showed in your book that the Mormon Church decided to hide about Athanasius Kircher? Answer: I don't have any knowledge about this specific allegation, but it sounds consistent with the pattern that BYU Special Collections, and the Mormon Church in general, has established for buying up and acquiring artifacts and hiding them from the public for as long as they can. In my book, I talk about how I found evidence that BYU has amassed one of the largest collections of Kircheriana in the world. I argue that Hugh Nibley knew that the name of Kircher's made-up source was Nephi, but decided to keep it quiet and hidden from the rest of the faculty at BYU. I have email correspondence showing that several BYU professors were pulling files from Dartmouth while trying to figure out whether the writings of Professor John Smith had influenced Joseph Smith or had been a source in the writing of the Book of Mormon. I don't know anything about the finds that you're talking about right now, but it sounds like they would have happened after the Hugh Nibley acquisitions that I talked about in my book.